So the question I've been asked is, would we be better off with electoral reform, for example, proportional representation, as being a better representation of public opinion? Well, you're right that if we had some form of proportional representation, that would give us a better representation in Parliament of different viewpoints. So we know that when we have systems like first past the post, that tends to produce particular large majorities, tends to favour particular stronger parties, and often that means that some viewpoints are not necessarily fully represented in Parliament. But whether that's a good or a bad thing depends very much on the kind of democracy you want to have or the kind of government you want to facilitate. So if we look at our system, you're right that this means that sometimes we don't get too many opinions represented. It means that sometimes we think that we are wasting votes because we might vote for a particular political party, but we know that they're not necessarily going to get enough votes to get a seat in Parliament, and that might lead to voter apathy, and that in turn might lead to people feeling they don't really want to take part in politics and feel that their views aren't really represented by Parliament at all. But on the other hand, first past the post does tend to produce strong governments. So it does mean that particular parties that then get elected and form a government do normally have the ability to make sure they can pass legislation through. There are examples of other legal systems that have very strong aspects of proportional representation where this is not the case. So often when we think about comparative politics, we used to give the example of Italy before it had electoral reform, where you'd find that often governments would only last for about a year before another coalition would be formed. And that was often seen as perhaps too problematic in the other direction because governments wouldn't necessarily be able to get their policies through. So we have to think about what do we want a government to be like and what kind of democracy do we want. Another element of our system with first past the post is we have constituency MPs. So sometimes in proportional representation, you end up with a system like a list, where you're voting for particular individuals on a list that a party has presented to you, and you have larger constituencies with a number of MPs representing you. And this means sometimes it can be hard for you to find out who your particular MP is, and it also means that it can be harder for you to then raise issues. And if you look at what happens in Parliament, often you find that an MP will use local issues, local aspects of stories from their constituents when making debates in Parliament. So on the one hand, you might feel you're not represented, but on the other hand, you have a particular MP in your constituency that you can go to, that you can raise issues, and you can keep track of them and see if they're voting to raise the issues that you want them to discuss. And that element can sometimes be lost when you have proportional representation. So really the answer to the question is, what kind of government do you want? Do you want one that you find through proportional representation, where you tend to find that there are broader representations of interests, where you might have more coalitions and you facilitate deliberation as you try and find a particular compromise? But you might find it harder to have a constituency MP, and you might find that sometimes decisions aren't made. Or do you want a system like we have with first past the post, where there might not necessarily be as much deliberation or as much compromise, but where you do tend to find you have strong governments who can get things done, and where individuals know who their MPs are so they can raise these issues in Parliament? So I'd love to be able to tell you which is the ideal perfect system, and when you mostly talk to political theorists, they will tell you that you need bits of both. So perhaps in some senses our system does need a little more of proportional representation, perhaps thinking along the lines of the way we have the additional member systems in the Welsh Senedd, the Senedd Cymru, or in Holyrood in the Scottish Parliament. So it's all about getting that balance between wanting decisions to be able to be made, but also facilitating deliberation and making sure minorities are adequately represented.